Well, welcome back from your morning tea break, everyone, and welcome to what I think is going to be one of the most anticipated sessions of this year's ANZSOG annual conference. My name's Anne Tiernan. I'm a professor and director of the Policy Innovation Hub at Griffith University, and it's a real pleasure to be here this morning. There's a minor change to the advertised program. Professor Richard Mulgan is unfortunately unable to join us here in Sydney. Richard injured himself in an accident last week. He's actually fine, but he's unable to travel. Fortunately for us, and unlike most academics I know, he sent us a paper which he'd finished, and I'm going to deliver that in his stead. Though probably far less effectively than those of you who know Richard would know he would do if he was here. He is, as many of you know, an outstanding scholar, a great expert on integrity and accountability in the Westminster system more generally. Luckily, our two other guests, both experts from the UK and New Zealand respectively, have made it safely, and we've agreed on a speaking order as follows. Since Australia, Canada and New Zealand and our other subnational governments represented here derive from the Westminster tradition, we agreed Dr. Catherine Haddon from the Institute for Government in the UK would begin. She'll be followed by Dr. Chris Eichbaum, who has been a key player in the ANZSOG network for a long time from his base at the School of Government at Victoria University, Wellington. I'll conclude the presentation by delivering Richard's paper, and then I'll quickly and seamlessly switch to my original role as chair of this session. And I'll pose some questions before turning it over to you for what I hope will be, and what I fully expect will be, a robust discussion. So, can you join me please in welcoming Dr. Catherine Haddon? Bios are in your conference program, so I'll leave those to you. Catherine, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne. And the first thing I should say is, given the last month and a half in the UK, it's particularly nice to be able to say goodbye to Westminster for at least a couple of weeks. So thank you very much for having me here at what has already been quite a fascinating conference, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the sessions. There's a lot that I can take away from the UK, not least your immigration system, because apparently we're changing ours and possibly moving to yours. So a lot of good lessons there for us. So the Westminster Model. The first thing I should say is, in the UK, amongst academics, certainly we discuss the Westminster Model, but interestingly, our public servants, our government, don't really talk about it in those terms. We don't use the phrase Westminster Model that much. But nonetheless, it does exist in some fashion or another. We'll get on to talking about in what way. And some of the pressures that we could have talked about, could be a very wide-ranging discussion about different facets of the Westminster Model. But there's a number of pressures in the UK at the moment that touch on that, many of which have been brought to life by Brexit. Territorial divisions, we've obviously got a big challenge now in terms of the different views from different parts of the UK about Brexit, the different ways that they voted. All sorts of issues around mixed delivery of public services, something that's a trend that's been occurring for a number of years now, and forms big challenges for the civil service in terms of what their role is within all of that. Questions of direct democracy, again, Brexit really put that one into sharp relief. And a lot of the media work that I had to do in the aftermath of it, the big questions were being asked were, A, can we vote again, please? B, when are we having an election? And having to explain to them it's not quite that simple. We now have a Fixed-Term Parliament Act. And just all sorts of questions about what is the balance that we now have between direct and representative democracy, and what will be the role of Parliament in deciding how and in what way we take forward the decision to leave the EU. And also, which turned into a bit of a day-by-day what's happening next, what the hell's going on, challenges to political, traditional party structures. A few months ago, if I talked about the demise of the Labour Party, people would have said, no chance, not going to happen. But we now face the possibility of a very real and very deep division within that party, and the possibility that it might split, and what that means for our traditional two-party structure, what that means for future of coalition government and voting patterns is a big question that we face. So all sorts of things that I could have come here to talk to you about, but given the audience, given my own interest, what I really want to focus on is the role of what we call civil service, for you, public service, in terms of the Westminster model. What is that traditional role? How is it represented, and how is it changing? Or what pressures is it undergoing at the moment? Now, I started off saying we don't really talk about the Westminster model, but we do talk about a principle. It's usually referred to as Northcote-Trevelyan principle, but it's expressed in different ways in terms of how the civil service and how the government talk about itself, what its core principles are. And we've seen lots of changes to that over the years, over the last sort of 150, 170 years, in different kinds of ways of expressing it. But it's centred most recently, and there's a paper, one of our select committees in Parliament is doing a new study, a massive study on the role of the civil service, and the Cabinet Office helpfully sent in a submission to that, which outlines its view of what its current principles are. And it talks about one abiding principle, appointment by merit, and 4 core values, integrity, honesty, impartiality, and objectivity. So the question then becomes, well, what do those mean? They're quite vague, they're quite loose terms. How does that translate into other issues? And I want to talk about 2 aspects of that. One is appointment by merit, and also I want to talk in particular about the objectivity, impartiality angle and the confusion that has arisen in the UK about what that means, and particularly through the lens of Brexit. The Westminster model, historically, these principles have never been that fixed. Like I say, they've evolved, they're a construct. They're interpreted by different people at different times in different ways, but they do form some sort of backstay. And within those debates, there's a lot that is changing, has changed, and there never really was a golden age, I would argue, in terms of when that Westminster model was some kind of perfect, ideal principle or construct. But the ambiguities for me are the most interesting part about it. In the UK in particular, that ambiguity is often embraced. Now, as you know, we don't have a codified constitution. We have a lot of grey areas. And as a constitutional expert, I spend a lot of my time going on the TV trying to explain not only what those grey areas are, but also what is the authority for them. And this seems to be one of the biggest challenges that we face today, is people's understanding of what empowers people to interpret these constructs in this way. Those words of objectivity, impartiality, we've seen 2 very different views of what those mean. And I would go further than say just that there is this ambiguity, but actually in the UK it's often embraced. Officials, they use sometimes that abiding principle, those sort of words as a kind of cloak or a defence, particularly in the discussions we've had recently about appointment by merit. But there also seems to be a tendency to actually revel in the ambiguity, in a kind of, you only really know how it actually works if you're on the inside. And we saw a lot of this in the discussions, it was a couple of years ago now, on appointment by merit. In the UK, we have a very clear system, in theory, of how senior officials are appointed. The role of the Civil Service Commission, the times at which they can be managed moves, the times at which officials have to go through a very formal, open competition process. But the reality is, going back many years, that there has always been a degree of ambiguity in that. The whole concept of managed moves really gives a remit and a possibility for the senior members of the civil service to actually shuffle people around when there's tensions, when there's a need to go for a sort of a practical solution rather than go through the formal principle. And a few years ago, the government, the coalition government as it then was, moved to try and solidify what was for them an important role of ministers in that process. Now, at first glance, you'd say, well, appointment by merit, there is no role for ministers in that. But again, historically, there always has been. The Prime Minister's role in appointing them formally, and also ministers' role in terms of the way in which they are often asked and often advised, or their views roughly sought in terms of how permanent secretaries are appointed. I've been doing a study for the last year or so looking at permanent secretaries, and in particular looking at the appointment of them, both through trying to get the statistics on it and also, and I have to say in terms of transparency, it is very difficult to find out when these were managed moves, when they were open competition and when that was introduced. But also interviewing them to talk about the process and the number of times that they would talk about how it was a very tricky situation in terms of putting a particular official in a particular place, how a certain minister's views were crucial to that. We saw that through the period that I was looking at, from 79 through to the present day. What the government tried to do a couple of years ago was introduce a mechanism whereby ministers were more formally asked for their advice on who should be, and in particular the aspect argument still remained about, have we now gone down a slippery slope towards changing appointment by merit? If you add into this other things that have occurred in the UK, obviously special advisors are a continuing issue. We've also got the introduction of a more cabinet form of what are called extended ministerial offices, which allow ministers to bring in more direct appointments into their private office effectively. So we're changing yet again the ways in which we're introducing more directly appointed or more political roles within the civil service. So as I say, it's a bit of a fluctuating point at the moment, but alongside other debates about impartiality and about objectivity of the civil service, it is a time at which I think the civil service needs to not just think about those core principles in an abstract term, but actually think about how they're reinterpreted in today's context. And that brings me to Brexit, which I could talk at length, but I won't bore you or bore myself silly with it. But Brexit was a fascinating one in terms of these concepts and what they mean, because we saw two very different views about how you interpret the words impartial and objective. And have to go back beyond Brexit to talk about this and the Scottish referendum. Now, in theory, constitutionally, a referendum is very different from an election. During an election, obviously, civil servants play no part in supporting the parties in putting forward their case. The argument that the government put in both the Scottish referendum and in the European referendum was that these were government policy positions, and therefore the civil service should support the governing party in terms of making its case. The argument that people on the other side put is, no, they shouldn't. They're a political position. The civil service should be playing no role in that. It's politicisation. So to understand the nuances that civil servants themselves view these, you have to go back to Brexit and the role of the Treasury and the then Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, Nick Macpherson. Now, I was at a lecture that he did talking about the role of the Treasury during that whole referendum. And he was asked a question, sort of a question from the audience by his former boss, former Cabinet Secretary Gus O'Donnell, who was basically saying, don't you think that the civil service played an excellent role during the referendum in terms of maintaining their impartiality? And Nick Macpherson slightly stuck it to Gus by turning around and saying, well, no, actually, I thought we played a partial role because our role is to serve the government of the day, and therefore we should play that partial role in doing so. And so you see a very different concept of what impartiality means. For some within government, what it means is actually serving the government of the day, but being able to serve future governments, even if they're of a different persuasion. But during that government, you should be partial towards the government that you are serving. For others on the outside, it shouldn't be so. A contrasting view was given by Bernard Jenkin, the chair of the Political and Constitutional and Public Administration Select Committee in Parliament, who in the run-up to the EU referendum was waging quite a strong campaign to try and reduce the possible role of the civil service in supporting government. He was a Leave campaigner, and he felt it was unduly influencing and providing additional resource to the Remain campaign. And it manifested itself on a number of fronts. At first, there were discussions about the role of PERDA, or whether or not during the referendum campaign proper, the civil service should play no role. And the government initially tried to withhold that and to not have any kind of PERDA, and so be able to use the civil service throughout. Criticisms were made of that, and eventually they agreed to institute it, but were able to use the civil service to make the case, to provide briefing papers, to even put out leaflets to the public in terms of making the case for Remain. This argument then continued during the referendum, and again the role of the Treasury was seen as crucial and was questioned in terms of overstepping the mark. The issue that came out was a couple of papers that the Treasury put out, and where does that dividing line lie between an objective view of the evidence and in use of the evidence in order to make an argument? And the critics felt that it veered very much towards the latter. And it goes to a very interesting and difficult question about what, if any, evidence is value-free, and how can the civil service maintain that sense of objectivity, of itself being an expert in making the case for these things, if it is seen to be partial in a way that undermines trust in it. The final area in which all these questions really came to the fore was in terms of preparation for Brexit. Now, what happened in the aftermath of the vote? Obviously, there was a lot of shock, but we then saw a weekend in which there was almost nobody from government or of any leadership position who was setting out the case for what happens now. We had a weekend where there seemed to be an absence of voices. Partly this was down to the fact that obviously David Cameron had announced his resignation. We were then going to have a leadership contest in the Conservative Party. There was no clear leadership from the Labour Party, who quickly disintegrated as well. And so there was a question mark about who now can take forward that argument. And it was put to members of the Leave campaign of, where is your preparation? What happens now? All the media are discussing this. Everyone wants to know, what the hell are we going to do? And they turned around and said, well, it wasn't for us to do it. It was for number 10 to do the preparation. And yet the civil service had been banned from being able to do any formal, detailed preparation for what happens in the event of Brexit. What they were able to do, and did do very well, was prepare for the possible market reactions. And the Treasury and the Bank of England did a lot of work on that. But any kind of preparation about what's now are the consequences in terms of policy, what will we need to do, even thinking through what kind of machinery, what kind of resources will we need to put into this in the aftermath, wasn't really thought about. And why does this matter so much? Well, it comes again to a crucial question about the role of the civil service. If you go back to that core Northcote-Trevelyan concept, it's about having a permanent body of officials who provide continuity for a political leadership which then will change. And that continuity is crucial to why you try to keep a permanent body of officials there, and why, certainly in the UK, you try to keep them depoliticised in terms of appointment process, so that there isn't that sort of political sway. I know it's different here. So these questions then about objectivity, about whether or not the civil service have a sort of crucial role in terms of guardianship or constitutional duty, perhaps, in terms of doing long-term planning, long-term strategic planning, really came to the fore. And again, it was worth thinking about the referendum and comparing it to general elections. In the UK, we have very swift, usually, changes of government, can often be overnight. And because of that, we've evolved a system of preparation whereby the civil service, during the election campaign, are able to look at the policy areas of different parties and think through what are the key issues that we're going to need to do, maybe machinery of government changes, maybe sort of swift policy changes, maybe it's just simply about, again, developing the resource available to be able to then make a swift change in this. And governments want to be effective as soon as possible. So for them to be effective, they need to know that their civil service are also geared up and ready to do so. With the referendum campaign, because of this hiatus or this lack of preparation that they were allowed to do, we didn't have that. What we instead had was a decision almost immediately afterwards that there would be a unit devoted to starting doing the preparation. But because we were going to have a Conservative leadership contest that would have continued till September, in theory, the civil service would have had the summer to prepare. What then happened was we had a change of government much quicker, and a new Prime Minister came in the following week, at a time at which the civil service, in terms of preparation, had done very little. They had only really started to think about desk space. They'd appointed one person to lead this unit, and they'd started to think about how to recruit people in. So they weren't getting very far in terms of the preparation that they needed to do, and suddenly they've got a new Prime Minister who wants to put out the statements and all the rest of it. So it comes to a real question, not just of why the civil service might want to do this kind of preparation in order to be more effective in terms of their relationship to the government of the day, but also what is that value that they play in society in kind of doing that preparation. Now, that and the objectivity question go to this core theme that I think Bill English put well earlier on, that the civil service don't necessarily still have the monopoly in terms of advice or gathering of expertise or information that perhaps they once did. So they therefore have to show their value, their value add in terms of the quality of work, the quality of advice, and the reputation and the trust that they are able to imbue in their work by being seen as being able to speak truth to power, by being able to be objective. So it comes to this core question that we will face in the UK of what now is their constitutional permissive remit in today's world for being the experts, for being the people able to do that? And are they being given the right kind of support and the right kind of constitutional role in order to be able to do that, whatever then may occur in terms of political changing and whatever may occur in terms of the ups and downs of the political world in which we live? And I will leave you there with that thought.
Thank you very much.